Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about Hex by Thomas Olde Heuvelt. So, every time I pick up a horror novel, I end up by the end thinking, maybe it's time for me to finally acknowledge that horror novels are just not my thing. But then inevitably I see another one that has a really cool premise, and I'm like, ooh, I really like the sound of that, and I love horror movies, and I used to love reading ghost stories. I'm gonna try it. And yeah, this book has a really cool premise. But before I delve into the review, I do want to quickly say, warning, this review is going to discuss violence, self-harm, and sexual violence and suicide, because all of them are prevalent in this book. But Hex is about a small town in New York called Black Springs. It's under a curse. See, back in the 17th century, a woman named Catherine was accused of witchcraft, was forced to kill her own son, was stoned and slaughtered. But she didn't quite stay dead. She has been haunting the town ever since. She appears largely at random, can provoke deep feelings of despair, and can drive people to end their own lives. In the 1800s, a group of exorcists bound her with chains, sewed up her eyes and her mouth, and this greatly limited her powers. But still, the people of the town need to be extremely careful. If someone hears her whispering, they will see horrific images and probably be driven to some form of self-harm. On top of that, no one can move away, and even just staying away for a couple of weeks often drives people to, try to harm themselves. For the past 200 years, the town has lived under a very strict decree. No one outside of the town is allowed to know what is going on in Black Springs, for fear that they will want to open the witch's eyes, which could return her to her full scope of power, and maybe doom the entire town. Hex is an organization within this town that's like half secret police, half community event organizers. They monitor where Catherine is at any given moment, tracking her on an app. They hide her when she appears somewhere outsiders might see her. They close off hiking trails and make up reasons for outsiders not to end up where she might be. And this is all designed for one purpose: to keep the town safe from Catherine's evil eye by keeping her presence secret. So, probably spoiled by my intro here, but I didn't really enjoy reading this book. And like with most of the horror novels I've reviewed for this channel, I don't really think it's the book's fault I didn't enjoy it. I think this is just not really my kind of book. There was a lot of really good things going on in this book. The writing is very evocative in many places and spooky. Some of the imagery was really, really effective, other not quite as much. Their setup in general, the premise, was absolutely fascinating. There's a lot of cool ideas here, but it just didn't really work for me. And the number one reason it didn't work for me is I never really got to the point that I cared about the characters. I've noticed a trend in modern horror novels where they always seem to set up characters to be at least slightly dislikable from the get-go, presumably so we don't get too upset when they have utterly horrific things happen to them / do utterly horrific things to other people. But I don't like it. I don't particularly care if terrible things are going to happen to them later. If I don't want to spend time with them at the beginning of the book, it's going to be really hard for me to convince myself to keep picking the book up. And one of our POV characters in this one spends most of his first section thinking dehumanizing things about his fellow men, thinking of them as animals, and thinking about one woman's overly large forehead, thinking how much he hates spending time with people. He does not come across as likable, and he ends up being one of our moral compasses in the leadership of the town. Another of our main characters should have been overall likable, and mostly was the most likable character in the book, and yet in one of the first scenes we see him in, we see him snarling at a dog that talking about how it gets on his nerves, which is understandable. Animals get on people's nerves sometimes. Etienne was driving me nuts because he was gnawing on my arm earlier. But it's one of those things that people use as a simple shorthand for this is not going to be a likable character when they dislike or are mean to animals. So that did not put me on the right foot with him. And then there's all the teenage boys. Yes, teenage boys do say shitty things, especially when you leave them alone by themselves. And yes, some of the characters are being set up to be something of antagonists, but do we really need to see them dropping slurs, in the very first conversation they appear in? And then there's Griselda, who I just got super tired of, because all of her POV sections were nothing but bemoaning her horrific past, which is fair, she had a bad past, but her obsession with Catherine and pate. Like, Christ, there were so many mentions of pate. And I get it was meant to be symbolic, I get that it's supposed to, you know, symbolize how the town chewed her up to make it something else or whatever, but it was like cartoon, oversized mallet version of metaphor. And it stood out even more to me because I don't know a single fucking human being who actually eats pate. I know cats who eat pate, I don't know people who eat pate. I also don't know people who go to the butcher shop for their meat. Like, that's not really a thing that exists around most US communities anymore. So all of it stood out as really out there and sort of clumsy, and it felt like it was drawing way too much attention to itself. And the character herself is just a cliche, overweight, sad sack of a middle-aged woman. She felt like the kind of character I would expect to see in a late 80s slasher, not in a book that came out in, what, like 2015? And then there's Tyler. Tyler's pretty much, pretty likable in the beginning, but he started out as such a cliche vlogger kid. And his sections were riddled with so many topical references, and trendy language, and slang, and ooh, look at this thing that was happening in 2012, that I had trouble focusing on anything else. Like, it started to feel a little bit like a period piece, like it was trying to center us in a time, and it sort of was. Because one of the main themes of this book is how modern civilization really isn't that far off from our barbaric roots. And so the author was clearly making a choice to stress the modern elements of it. But it felt, for lack of a better phrase, dated. Specifically, it felt like when you accidentally drop slang from like 5 years ago that was a little cringy when it was popular 5 years ago, and now is just super embarrassing that it was ever part of your lexicon. But there's a couple of other things that I found a little bit odd about the setting. This is set in a small town in the Hudson River Valley. And I have never lived in that exact area, but I have lived in New Hampshire and Vermont, not too far away. And there was just something about the entire town and the setup that felt off to me. Like, there was the whole butcher shop thing that I already mentioned, and that felt weird. But there was also these random moments when people kept insisting they have rights because they're Americans. And yeah, people do this in certain situations. I have definitely seen people screaming about how they have rights because they're Americans. But somehow the way it was presented in this book felt less like reality and more like cartoonish jingoism. And eventually I even paused to look in the back of the book to see the author's bio, and yeah, it turns out he is not from the US, he's Dutch. And I mean, that's fine. We, as Americans, regularly write about places that we are not from. And even within America, people are writing about the South when they're from the North, and are writing about the North when they're from the South. But it was just noticeably off to me, and that made a lot of the setting feel subtly wrong in a way that it took me a while to put my finger on. Another part of the story that was just sort of subtly wrong to me is the severity of people's responses to the events within the book. Like, spoiler here, the dog dies. And while he is missing, the entire town knows about it. Hex is called in to track down the pet, and there are literally people searching the woods to find this dog. And once he dies, everyone in town is like sort of in that we might be next kind of feeling and freaking out really over the top. And I mean, I love my pets, ignoring the fact that one of them just dropped a very strong poop in the litter box. But I love my pets. Most people I know think of their pets as part of their family, but that doesn't equal to people literally sending out, like, basically the city's secret police to find their lost dog. And I get that there's a sense of it being like, oh, because the witch is present there all the time, there's this feeling of, oh, that maybe this is a hint that the witch is up to something, and when the dog is found, it's obvious that the witch had a hand in this. But I don't believe this town doesn't regularly lose dogs. Like, I'm sorry, anyone who has had dogs in a community know that they get out, they escape, they run off, they do things, they get hit by cars. Bad things happen. And I cannot believe that this level of response is called out every single time someone leaves their kennel door open and the dog escapes. Now, once they do find the dog, I understand some of the reaction, like people being like, oh, okay, this was the witch was doing something. But to me, there's still a leap between, oh my god, the witch killed a family dog, to, oh my god, the witch is going to kill all of us. So the responses just felt a little bit out of place here. And then there's the flogging. There's a point in this book when the town is voting to punish some kids, and they follow the letter of the law that was set out in the 1700s, I think. And that means that these kids are going to be flogged with a cat of nine tails. And the community is voting on whether or not to do this, and they vote yes. And first of all, our POV characters just assume the town won't actually do it, because, like, that's absurd. They would never do that. And then they're all, like, earth-shatteringly horrified when the town votes yes to it. And then it is described as, like, permanently traumatizing the entire community watching this event happen, the actual flogging. And I know, flogging is torture. That is true. I'm not trying to belittle the pain that was caused by this. But we're really not that far away from the time when this sort of thing was an everyday kind of occurrence. And maybe it's because I'm a tour guide in the French Quarter and I talk about the tortures that we did to people back in the 1800s, but this doesn't seem that far out of the realm of normal to me. Also, there's the fact that I grew up in the South, where, at least during my childhood, it was still considered perfectly normal to spank your kids. Like, most of the kids I knew, that if they misbehaved, they were sent out back to cut a switch to bring inside for their mom to switch them. Like, this does not feel like something is such a big leap. Because yeah, flogging is significantly worse than switching. But it's definitely in the same spectrum here. And the people in this book treat it as utterly inconceivable that these teenagers might be flogged. And it read to me like maybe in the earlier drafts of the book, the boys were actually being sentenced to death, and the reactions of the town folk were not quite updated when that was changed. But, I mean, hell, flogging is something people do for pleasure, for God's sakes. Presumably not with a cat of nine tails in a public square, but this is not a kind of, like, destroy the foundations of your community's morality kind of thing. This is just a bad thing that people might do. And I even would have bought it if the community was only lightly horrified, like, oh, are we really gonna do that? That's not okay. And then the executioner went a little bit too hard and did a lot more damage than people were expecting, and everyone was like, oh, okay. And that's where the trauma came in. But that's not how it's presented in this book. And part of that helped make the ending feel, I don't know, a little bit forced. Like, first of all, the ending goes on forever. Like, the climax has endless scenes of people doing terrible things and insanity and chaos. And it's not like one of those, like, this was too much for me. I honestly felt very emotionally detached from any of it. Like, it did not hit me as real, as, like, emotional or scary. There were just a couple moments I was like, okay, that's a bit far, but okay. And it's all very man is the true monster kind of stuff, which feels really like it was overdone back in the 1950s. And I'm not sure if I even buy the entire premise of that theme, because it really doesn't fully make sense, the transition of how Catherine's behavior is in the climax versus how it was leading up to that point. And it all just left me with a general feeling of, okay. And, like, there was a lot of really interesting stuff with intrusive thoughts, with mourning and magical thinking, but once the climax really kicks into gear, it's all just sort of messy. It's just a lot of horror movie imagery shoved at your face. And then we get the epilogue, and it ends super abruptly. And, like, I don't think it's a bad ending. I think it's a good, solid ending for the book that it exists in. But it's just a really sharp period to what was, like, the longest descriptive clause in the world. But there are also a couple of other things that I'm not entirely sure I buy in this book. First of all, the idea that the US government would just let this go on, trust the town to largely self-govern, provide them stupid amounts of money, and all just out of the fear that if outsiders came in, they would inevitably want to open Catherine's eyes, even though there seems to be no actual proof that outsiders would have this urge. And it all just sort of feels like an excuse to create this closed room feeling. And, like, don't get me wrong, the trapped feeling of the book was one of my favorite elements of the book. So I understand why the author set it up the way he did. I just don't quite buy the US government buying into this. And also, I really, really, really don't buy the US government and the town still letting anyone move to this town. Like, we have examples of how the US government actually deals with towns in deadly locations. Like, Centralia, Pennsylvania is one of the most famous examples here. Like, it is a town that famously a large fire was started underground and started releasing basically toxic fumes into the air, and it became too dangerous for people to continue living in that area. So the government bought all the local properties, helping people relocate. And the few who refused to leave their homes and were like, no, this is my land, I'm staying, they were allowed to stay, but no one else is allowed to move in. And when those few last people die, it will be a dead community. And, like, honestly, that feels like what should be happening here. I'm not sure why the US government didn't take this track with Black Springs in this book. And, like, yeah, it's fiction. Things don't have to be historically accurate or real, because, I mean, my god, in the real world there aren't, like, ghost witches walking around and cursing people either. But I feel like to get a feeling of verisimilitude, this needed to be explained why this wasn't the way it was going to happen. And, like, one of the first events in this book is a new couple are moving into town, and yes, Hex is assigned to try to discourage them from buying the house, but they're only allowed to do stupid prank-type things, like they pretend there's a club being built right behind the house, and they hire the local teens to be all intimidating and creepy, but they are not allowed to just buy the property out from under this couple so they don't move here. And the only explanation offered ever throughout the entire book of why the town still lets people move in is that the town council doesn't want to let the community die a natural death. And I really expected there to be a twist somewhere in this, that maybe Catherine was secretly forcing them to keep the community alive because she needed the blood or whatever. But instead it just feels like an excuse for the characters to blast exposition at these new folks so that the reader gets the exposition. And then those new folks just sort of completely disappear from the narrative. Like, there's one mention of them halfway through the book, and one of them gets mentioned in the climax. And that's it. And therefore it felt like a dropped plot thread. It also felt like a twist that did not happen, and there was the logical gap there too. So overall, the entire setup of that left me feeling really unsatisfied. Also, something that I personally found annoying is we don't have exposition at the very beginning of this book. We have, like, a few scenes where we're just shown things with no explanation of what's going on, which the very first scene of the book, I had no goddamn idea what was going on. I had to read it like 3 times to even figure out, like, what was happening, and I'm still not entirely sure how the hell they got the pipe organ around Catherine when they're not supposed to touch her, but there's just a lot of this sort of thing throughout this book. There's, it's just a quirk I noticed of the writing, that there are a lot of scenes where we're dropped into the aftermath of a scene without actually given the information of what happened, what caused all this, and then after a few pages we jump back to the explanation of what happened. And it's fine once or twice, like, okay, if you have a reason to do this in your narrative, if you think it's going to provide a bigger gut punch, go for it, but by the end it was just getting really annoying because it was happening like every other chapter. And, like, I don't like actually reading 2 or 3 pages where I don't know what the fuck is going on before I get the explanation of what the fuck is going on. And then there are just the boobs. Like, I get that boobs are very common in horror, and a friend of mine was explaining it, and my friend, Art with the Dragon King here on YouTube, I think he's still making YouTube videos, I don't know, but he was explaining it to me that it's about the draw in and the repulsion, that the boobs draw you in and you go, ooh, look, and you get all close, and then it's like, oh god, gore. But I'm not even entirely sure what the hell's going on here. I feel like just it's another case of a male author putting in so many unnecessary boobies. And I get that some of it was meant to be metaphorical, but while it is hard to miss the metaphor's presence, I'm not actually entirely sure what the metaphor was supposed to say. Like, sure, boobs are sexualized, boobs are maternal, and the author was clearly thinking about how the witch was punished for her femininity, and, like, it's that balance of sexuality versus maternality, its Madonna horror complex, all that stuff is probably in there, but I did not get a concrete idea of what the author is trying to say with all that. It just comes across as another book with a male author that is fucking obsessed with breasts. And we get the witch's tit being revealed and cut, we get Griselda's boob being squeezed, we get a random moment of focusing on Tyler's nipple, which, you know, yay, objectifying both male and female tits. We get a weird as fuck vision of a giant scaffolding of children in the shape of a tit, which that image just did not hit for me. It was just sort of ridiculous, and I know it was supposed to be sort of horrific, and I'm just sitting here like, what? And it was just a lot. And even though I know it's slightly less prevalent than the boobs, there is also sexual violence against women in this book, and I do need to mention it. And also, I get it, it's horror. That is a very common element of horror. And it just felt a bit gratuitous to me. And this is one of those things that I can't really put my finger on what made this feel gratuitous versus many other times I've read about sexual violence in books and I've been like, yes, that is part of the narrative. They're saying something important here. It works for me. But here, it just sort of felt like, I guess that's part of this book now, too. Overall, this book honestly just sort of underwhelmed me. I do find it funny that the little blurb on the cover of the book is from Stephen King, calling this book totally, brilliantly original, because objectively, I found it a little bit derivative of Pet Sematary. But I will say, some of the things that I found wrong with this book are flaws. Like, objectively, they are flaws. But, as usual, they're flaws I don't think I'd notice if I had really liked the book. And the majority of what I did not like about this book, I know were personal taste elements. I prefer books with likable characters. I prefer books with less discussion of boobs. I prefer books that don't focus on the horrific inhumanity of man. Overall, again, I feel like I didn't like this book, not because it isn't good, but because it's not my kind of book. So yeah, if you like spooky stories about mob mentality, trolley problems, and pate, and don't mind dislikable characters, you might really like this book.